Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Elgato. Today, we'll be exploring one of the most controversial historical events of the 21st century, the events of September 11th. On the morning of September 11, 2001, 15 men from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, one from Lebanon, and one from Egypt hijacked 4 planes from 3 different airports along the United States East Coast. 2 of these planes were flown into the World Trade Center buildings in New York. 1 crashed into the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C., and the 4th crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. In total, 2,996 people died that day, and the world changed forever in just under 2.5 hours. The U.S. government blamed the terrorist group Al-Qaeda for the attack and their leader Osama bin Laden for recruiting and funding the hijackers. That is the official story, but over the years, people have questioned this narrative. So-called truthers believe that the U.S. government not only knew about the attacks, but might have even orchestrated them themselves. They claim to know how and why it was done. So who really was behind 9/11? Within the truther movement, there are many different theories, so we will cover just a few of the main ones that have been hotly debated over the years. Firstly, truthers argue that the U.S. government used controlled thermite explosions to bring down the towers. The burning jet fuel, which supposedly melted the steel beams, burns between 426 and 815 degrees Fahrenheit. That's much cooler than the 1,510 degrees needed to melt the Twin Towers steel supports. They say only thermite is hot enough to do that. They also point to the puffs of air seen as the towers collapsed, claiming this is proof of a controlled explosion happening on certain floors just below the collapsing building. On the other side, there are answers to this as well. They say that to melt through a vertical steel beam, thermite would need special high-temperature containment to prevent the molten iron from dripping off and doing no more damage. They admit that the burning jet fuel wasn't hot enough to melt the building's steel beams, but was hot enough to weaken them. That's the crucial point. Add to that tons of combustible materials in the office buildings, and the beams were weakened to the point where the floor below could no longer support the weight above. The puffs of air were not from controlled explosions, but rather from the crashing floors expelling air as they fell. Each floor of the Twin Towers was about 1/4 mile in size, and all that air had to be released somehow. But why did World Trade Center Building 7 collapse? Building 7 collapsed 7 hours after the Twin Towers fell. This entirely separate 47-story building came down. It was nearby but had not been hit by a plane, and somehow still managed to collapse into its own footprint 7 hours later. Again, truthers believe thermite was to blame. They say that at one point it looked as if the building was in free fall as it came down, which shouldn't be possible as the building's support should have resisted and slowed down the collapse. So how could this have happened unless it was through controlled demolition? The official story is that yes, World Trade Center Building 7 was not hit by a plane, but it was hit by debris from one of the Twin Towers that collapsed. This sparked severe fires for hours in the building, which weakened a critical support column inside. The fires were very fierce and went unchecked by firefighters for hours, eventually weakening more and more exterior metal beams until the floors began to cave in, causing the collapse. The free fall for those seconds happened in 3 stages. First, the building began to buckle and only fell a few feet because the columns were starting to break. Then, with no columns to support those floors, they fell freely for 8 stories. Eventually, they slowed to below free fall speed as they collapsed into non-buckled structures at the bottom of the building. Other truthers then ask why the Air Force did not take down the planes. The government's NORAD system should have issued a stand-down order to the planes as soon as they deviated from their flight paths. If they failed to respond, they should have surely been shot down. However, NORAD didn't actually track commercial planes before 9/11. That was the job of the nation's air traffic control teams. Unfortunately, the hijackers had turned off the plane's transponders, making them difficult to locate. By the time air traffic control alerted NORAD of the missing planes and fighter jets were scrambled, one of the planes had already hit the towers, and the fighters never reached the remaining planes. Regardless of which stance you take, whether you believe that planes and jet fuel brought the towers down, or that it was a government-staged attack with controlled thermite explosions, the question still remains. Why? Why would a government supposedly kill almost 3,000 people and then blame it on a terrorist group. Truthers claim it was used by the US government to justify things like the Patriot Act, which came into effect 13 days after the attack and aimed at strengthening security and the power of law enforcement agencies. But truthers claim it didn't do that. Instead, it was used to take away people's personal freedoms and give the government more power to control the population. They also think it was a false flag attack. After 9/11, the US government had popular support to go to war in the Middle East and do essentially whatever they wanted. They say this involved taking out those who opposed them and getting their hands on oil, and anyone who objected to any of this was deemed an American enemy. This version should be clearer and more polished. While there are many issues with the legitimacy and conduct of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, would the US government have killed its own citizens to justify these wars and gain more power? That is the question. Since the 9/11 attacks, there have been countless al-Qaeda operatives who have claimed responsibility for the attack, including Osama bin Laden himself on several occasions. Many people believe that the government would have been crazy to do this and that the information would almost certainly have leaked out. How could a country that has seen so many political leaks in its history suppress the most insane, devastating, and hardest to contain information of all time? There are still people today on both sides of the debate about whether the US government would actually do this to itself to justify the wars and give itself increased powers. So, is the government lying? Were they capable of this both morally and technically? Does the evidence sway you one way or the other? Years on, it's still a hotly debated question because it makes people question their own trust in governments, scientists, history, and even themselves. For now, though, the conventional story that 19 terrorists committed an unspeakable act of horror on that day remains the leading explanation. What do you think? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Elgato for more intriguing content.